June 25, 1876, a battlefield in Montana. Hundreds would die, and history would write its version of the truth. But 75 years later, one man finally spoke, revealing a side of Custer's last stand no one had ever heard. Why did he wait? And what secret did he carry until his final breath? The sun rose over the Montana plains, casting long, golden shadows across the rolling hills of the Little Bighorn Valley. For the men of the 7th Cavalry, it was just another day on campaign, but history would remember it as one of America's most fateful mornings. Among them was a young private named Charles Windolph, 24 years old, a man who had no idea he would soon become the last surviving American veteran of the battle, and the last man to see General George Armstrong Custer alive. "I didn't join," Windolph would say decades later. "But when you serve, you ride where you're told, and you face what's waiting." By the time he was 99 years old, the memory of that day still burned in his mind. For 75 years, he kept most of it to himself, a silence so profound that historians never knew how much he had seen, until 1947, when he finally told the truth in his memoir I Fought With Custer. It was a testimony that didn't just fill in the gaps, it challenged the very way history remembered Custer's last stand. Windolph had enlisted in 1873, joining H Company under the steady hand of Captain Frederick Benteen, a man he would later call, "the finest soldier and truest gentleman I ever knew." Benteen's leadership was calm, steady, and personal, a stark contrast to Custer's. Custer, larger than life and famous even then, inspired awe, but kept a distance from the enlisted men. Windolph recalled. But Benteen had my heart from the start. The morning of June 25 began with tense whispers among the officers. Scouts had returned with word of a massive native encampment, the camp of Sitting Bull, stretching across the valley. Reports suggested hundreds, maybe thousands, of warriors. Windolph, walking toward Benteen's tent to ask about swapping his horse, accidentally overheard an exchange he would never forget. "Shouldn't we keep the regiment together?" Benteen urged Custer. "If that camp's as big as they say, we'll need every soul we've got." Custer's reply was curt, almost cold, "You have your orders." That decision, made in a matter of seconds, would divide the 7th Cavalry into separate columns. 200 men would ride with Custer. Many of them would never return. "I never got to ask about that horse," Windolph would later say with a faint, bitter smile. By midday, the 7th Cavalry, 600 strong, rode with confidence. They expected to face no more than 1,500 warriors, poorly armed, poorly led. "We were wrong. Terribly wrong," Windolph admitted years later. Custer's column disappeared into the hills first, while Benteen's company pushed forward through rough terrain, the heat pressing down like a hammer. Hours passed with no sign of the enemy, just the wind, the creak of saddle leather, and the growing weight of uncertainty. Then, a lone rider appeared, a sergeant from Tom Custer's company. He carried a message for Benteen, Big Village. "Be quick. Bring packs." They were orders Benteen would not follow. As the sergeant passed, he called out to the men, "They've got the enemy on the run." Cheers followed. Most believed they were heading for another easy victory, the kind the 7th had grown used to. But history would show this was no routine engagement. "It'd be easy to say we were thinking of glory," Windolph reflected later. "But I reckon most of the plain soldiers were thinking about how good a nice cold bottle of beer would taste right now." Around 4 p.m., Benteen's men reached a ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley. The sounds of battle drifted toward them, rifle fire, shouting, chaos. Benteen ordered his men to draw weapons and press forward. Cresting the ridge, Windolph saw the valley laid out below, a massive encampment, warriors swarming, and, to the north, a desperate cluster of soldiers fighting for their lives. It was Major Marcus Reno's command, battered, bloodied, barely holding. They charged to his aid. "I'll never forget the first sight of that hill," Windolph said. "Those men were frightened and disorganized, and it was only the grace of God that kept them alive." On what became known as Reno Hill, Benteen quickly took control. Men threw up makeshift defenses, saddles, ammunition boxes, anything that could stop a bullet. But as they scanned the horizon, one question cut through the tension like a knife. "Where's Custer?" Windolph assumed he had begun his attack to the north. But as the minutes dragged into hours, the sound of gunfire faded, and dread began to settle in. The sun was dipping low when the first wave hit Reno Hill. Native warriors, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, began to press in from all sides. At first, the attacks were probing, testing the weak points in the Americans' hasty defenses. But the pressure was relentless. It wasn't like in the storybooks, Windolph recalled. There wasn't a great charge with everyone screaming at once. It was worse than that. They came in small groups, from every direction, all the time. You couldn't rest. You couldn't breathe. Bullets cracked overhead, some finding their mark. Arrows arced through the smoky air. Horses screamed and collapsed. Men cursed, prayed, or stared silently into the dust, gripping their rifles. Windolph and H Company were ordered to hold the southern face of the hill. The position was exposed, too exposed. Higher ridges to the east gave enemy sharpshooters a clear view of their lines. We piled up whatever we could, food boxes, saddle bags, dead horses if we had to. It wasn't much, but it made you feel like you weren't naked to the world, he said. The battle raged for hours. By nightfall, a dozen Americans were dead and more than 30 wounded. The ground was littered with spent shells and shattered gear. Yet, strangely, the warriors never launched a single unified charge. Instead, they kept the soldiers pinned with constant, uncoordinated attacks, a steady, grinding kind of warfare that slowly drained the men's strength. That night, there was no moon. The only light came from the fires in Sitting Bull's camp far below, where the distant thump of drums carried up through the darkness. "It was the loneliest sound I ever heard," Windolph said quietly. 1,000 voices dancing, laughing, celebrating, and all around me were the cries of the dying. Sleep was impossible. Men dug into the hard earth with knives, tin cups, even their bare hands, anything to deepen their shallow rifle pits. Windolph and his friend, Private Julian Jones, worked side by side until they were nearly finished. Then Jones stood up to take off his heavy overcoat. A single shot rang out. Jones dropped instantly. He screamed once. Then, nothing, Windolph said. The bullet had gone straight through his heart. Moments later, more rounds smacked into the ground, sending dirt and splinters flying. Windolph ducked low, his own rifle tight in his hands. When the shooting finally slowed, the company surgeon rushed over. "You hit?" he demanded. "No," Windolph answered, but the surgeon told him to check. He slid his hand inside his shirt. When it came out, it was wet with blood. A ricochet had caught him in the side, but the adrenaline had numbed the pain. It was only a flesh wound. Windolph waved the surgeon away. "Patch the bad ones first," he said. Minutes later, another shot shattered the rifle in his hands, splitting the wood and sending fragments into the air. It was as if the hill itself had turned hostile. By midday on June 26, another threat loomed: thirst. The heat was merciless, and their canteens were empty. The wounded moaned for water, their lips cracked and swollen. Windolph volunteered to provide covering fire for a water party. Crawling over the ridge, the small group sprinted toward the river. Enemy fire erupted instantly. Men fell. The survivors scrambled back with as much water as they could carry. "We didn't bring back enough," Windolph admitted. But for the men who got it, it was life. That bravery didn't go unnoticed. Captain Benteen himself praised the volunteers and, later that day, promoted Windolph to sergeant for his actions under fire. Through it all, the same question haunted them: where was Custer? "We told ourselves they couldn't all be dead," Windolph recalled. "Not Custer. Not those men. They were too good. Too gallant." But as the day wore on, hope began to thin like smoke in the wind. That night, the enemy's numbers seemed to diminish. Fires flickered in the distance, but the intensity of the attacks faded. By dawn on June 27, scouts confirmed what many had suspected: large numbers of warriors had left the valley. The men on Reno Hill were alive. But the fate of the others was still unknown. When General Alfred Terry's reinforcements finally reached them later that morning, the news was worse than anything they could have imagined. "Custer and all his men are believed dead," Terry said, his voice breaking. "Every last one." Windolph never forgot the look on Terry's face. "There were tears running down his cheeks," he said. "And I think most of us had tears in our eyes, too." Benteen chose 14 men to ride with him and confirm the reports. Windolph was among them. The ride north was silent, heavy with dread. What they found defied description. The field was littered with the bodies of more than 200 soldiers, stripped of their uniforms under the burning sun. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. Flies swarmed in black clouds. Custer's body lay on the slope of what would forever be known as Last Stand Hill, next to his brother Tom. He had 2 bullet wounds, one in the chest, one in the temple. "Aside from that, he looked like he was sleeping," Windolph said softly. Everywhere he turned, Windolph saw faces he knew, men he had eaten with, laughed with, marched with. Now, they lay silent, their stories ended in the dust of the Montana hills. Windolph would not describe the burial in detail. "Out of respect for my friends, I'll leave it at that," he wrote years later. But he never forgot the weight of the shovel in his hands, or the sound of earth falling over the bodies. That day on Last Stand Hill was not just the end of Custer, it was the end of an era. And for Charles Windolph, it marked the beginning of 75 years of silence. When the burial detail rode back from Last Stand Hill, the valley seemed unnaturally quiet. The smoke from the abandoned camps drifted lazily into a sky that now looked too blue, too calm, for what had happened here. Windolph kept his eyes forward, his rifle across his lap, his thoughts locked away where no one could reach them. "We didn't talk much on the ride back," he would later say. "There wasn't anything to say that could make it better." The next day, the survivors of Reno Hill began the long march away from the Little Bighorn. The column was a patchwork of the living and the barely living, men with bandaged heads, men slumped in the saddle from exhaustion, men walking alongside wagons carrying the dead and the dying. It was a grim procession, and Windolph knew it was one history would remember for all the wrong reasons. "We left as fewer men than we came," he said. "And we carried something heavier than our rifles. We carried the knowledge of what happened here." In the weeks that followed, newspapers across the country exploded with headlines. The defeat was called shocking, disgraceful, even incomprehensible. Writers who had never set foot on the plains wrote confident accounts of what must have happened that day. Some blamed Custer's recklessness. Others pointed fingers at Benteen or Reno. Rumors swirled that orders had been ignored, that cowardice had played a role, that betrayal had sealed the fate of the 7th Cavalry. Windolph stayed silent. "It's easy for a man in an armchair to tell you how you should have fought a battle," he said dryly. "But when you're in the dust with bullets coming from every direction, you don't have the luxury of armchair thinking." For Windolph, the army continued. He served in the 7th Cavalry for another 7 years. He fought in smaller engagements, rode endless patrols across the plains, and saw the slow, grinding changes of a frontier closing in. Through it all, he carried the memory of the Little Bighorn like a shadow. He didn't speak of it, not to new recruits, not to fellow veterans, not even to the woman he would eventually marry. "It was too raw," he explained decades later. "And maybe I thought if I didn't speak it out loud, it wouldn't come for me in the night." When he finally left the army, Windolph built a quieter life. He married, worked hard, and became a respected figure in his community. To most people who knew him, he was simply a kind, steady man with a soldier's bearing and eyes that seemed to look past you into another time. What they didn't know was that every June, when the sun beat down and the air was still, Windolph felt himself back on that hill, hearing the sharp crack of rifles and the distant thunder of hooves. The years passed. One by one, the other survivors of the Little Bighorn passed away. By the time the 1930s rolled in, there were only a handful left, and Windolph was the only one who had been on Reno Hill from the first shot to the last. It was then that historians began knocking on his door. They wanted his story, the first-hand account that could fill in the blanks left by fading memories and contradictory reports. At first, Windolph refused. "I'd kept my peace for more than 50 years, he said. "Why start talking now?" But they were persistent. And finally, in his 80s, Windolph agreed to tell them everything he remembered. What emerged over months of interviews was not just a recollection, it was a revelation. He described the clash between Benteen and Custer on the morning of June 25, the disagreement over splitting the regiment when the enemy camp was far larger than expected. He revealed that Benteen had received a desperate message from Custer, "Big village, be quick, bring packs," but never acted on it. And he gave vivid, almost cinematic detail to the fight on Reno Hill, the heat, the thirst, the relentless attacks, the moment-by-moment choices that meant life or death. When his memoir was finally compiled and published in 1947 under the title I Fought With Custer, it shook the historical community. Here was not the voice of an officer defending his decisions or a newspaper writer chasing headlines, it was the voice of a plain soldier who had been there, who had seen it all from the dust and blood level. And it complicated everything. Windolph didn't vilify Custer, nor did he absolve him completely. He didn't cast Benteen as a coward or a savior, though he openly called him, "the finest soldier and greatest gentleman I ever knew." Instead, he painted a picture of a battle shaped by misunderstanding, bad timing, and the sheer, unstoppable force of the opposition they faced. "We were wrong about the numbers," he admitted. "And we were wrong about the fight we thought we were riding into." By the time his book came out, Charles Windolph was the last surviving white American veteran of the Little Bighorn. His words became a cornerstone for historians and a touchstone for anyone trying to understand what really happened on those 2 days in June 1876. 3 years later, in 1950, Windolph died peacefully at the age of 99. In death, he finally joined the 268 men who had fallen on that summer day, the men whose memory he had carried for nearly 3/4 of a century. "I suppose I was spared so I could remember," he once said. "And now I've told it, so someone else can remember." For more hidden stories where history meets mystery, subscribe to Natives Untold.